Unit 6, Participating in Government. Chapter 16, Political Parties. Our chapter objectives, with regards to development of parties, we will summarize the role of political parties in American politics. In Section 2, looking at party organization, we will describe the organization and function of American political parties. And with regards to nominating candidates, in Section 3, we'll discuss the advantages and the disadvantages of the four methods of nominating candidates. Section 1, the development of parties. Parties and party systems. In a one-party system, the party, in effect, is the government. Such one-party systems are usually found in authoritarian governments. An example of such would be the current government of China. China has a communist government, and that's their economic system is communism. But even though they've begun to move towards more of a free market economy, the government of China is still an authoritarian government run by the Communist Party, and it is a one-party system. The Soviet Union, in its heyday, also was a one-party system run by the Communist Party. In nations with a multi-party system, several political parties compete for control of the government, and they must often form coalitions to do so. Now, the drawback to this is that oftentimes those coalitions break down, which leads to a government that isn't very stable and often has a hard time getting anything accomplished. In the dozen nations with a two-party system, two major political parties dominate the dominate the government, and that's really the situation we have in the United States. We have two major political parties, and although, as we often see frequently, the two major political parties end up polarizing the American people and make it difficult for anything to get accomplished as well. Now looking at the growth of American parties. Although the founders, or the founding fathers, distrusted factions, by the end of President Washington's second term, two political parties had formed. And those were the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Those were the first two political parties. Now, of course, over the years, things have shifted, and those are no longer the two major political parties. The two-party system in the United States changed as political parties appeared and declined. On the eve of the Civil War, the Republican Party was born. After the war, it dominated the national scene, with the Democrats the minority party. During the Great Depression, the Democratic Party gained power and remained the majority party for most of the next 50 years. The Republican Party gained the presidency in 6 of the next 9 terms, starting in 1968, and in 1994 they regained control of both houses of Congress. Of course, since that time, things have changed. And in 2008, the Democrats had control of both houses of Congress and the White House. But that was short-lived as the Republicans gained control of the House of Representatives in 2010, and that's the way that things have stayed, with the Republicans controlling the House, Democrats controlling the Senate, and we have a Democrat currently as president. The role of minor parties. Third parties, or minor parties, have been a part of the American political scene since the early years of the Republic. All third parties have one thing in common, and that's that they do not believe that the two major parties are meeting certain national needs. In general, third parties fall into one of 3 categories. The single-issue party, which means they're really focused on one issue. The ideological party, that has a basic ideology that is the foundation of really their stance on all issues. And the splinter party. And the splinter party is usually one where you've had a group that has splintered off, so to speak, or broke away from another party. Occasionally, third parties influence the outcome of national elections by drawing enough votes to tip the balance to one of the major parties. For the most part, with the minor parties, we see them sometimes win some state and local offices. Once in a while on the federal level, you may have a third-party candidate that maybe gets elected to Congress. We've never really had one make much of an impact on the presidency other than possibly, like it says, tip the election to one other party. Some examples where that has happened: in 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush, the elder of the two Bushes that have been president, he was running for re-election, and he was a Republican, and the Democrats, they ran Bill Clinton. And then Ross Perot ran as a third-party candidate. Ross Perot was not really a politician, didn't come from a political background. He was more of an entrepreneur and kind of ran as a Washington outsider, which was part of his appeal. He initially was in the race, then dropped out, and then re-entered. He lost a lot of credibility when he did that, but eventually they ended up picking Ross Perot, ultimately Ross Perot did run, pulled votes away from George W. Bush. I mean, it is the belief that most of the people that voted for Ross Perot likely would have voted for Bush had Perot not been in the election. And that tipped the election to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton would run again in 1996, running for re-election against the Republican candidate Bob Dole, and once again, Ross Perot would enter. Ross Perot would be less of a factor in the 96 race, but still probably pulled votes away from Bob Dole. Then, the 2000 election was another one. In the 2000 election, Ralph Nader ran. Now, Nader's run several times, but 2000 was his best showing. And the 2000 presidential election was very close and controversial. Al Gore actually took more popular votes than George W. Bush, but in the Electoral College, which actually decides the election, George W. Bush won, everything hinging on the state of Florida, which was controversial and contested. But ultimately, the presence of Nader as a reasonably strong third-party candidate probably, within all likelihood, tipped the election, because once again, the common belief is most of the people that voted for Nader would have voted for Gore had Nader not been in the race. And the margin of victory for Bush was very small. It wouldn't have taken, some of those states were very close. If you'd taken Nader's votes away and given them to Gore, it probably would have tipped the election. So we've never really seen a third-party candidate really have much of a real shot at getting elected, but they will sometimes ultimately affect the outcome of a race. And third parties' ideas were often later adopted by the major parties. So a lot of times you may have a third party that does pretty well because their message, or one of their messages, one of their ideas, resonates with the American electorate. And there's a group of American people that really buy into their idea, and oftentimes one of the major parties will pick up that idea then and adopt it as their own. Third parties face many obstacles. It's difficult for them to get on the ballot, especially in a presidential election, being that presidential elections are national elections. And once again, it's not just popular vote, it's based on the Electoral College. And if you don't get on the ballot in a state, you have no shot at really winning the electoral votes for that state. So oftentimes third-party candidates may get on the ballot in some or even most states, but they don't really have much shot at getting elected unless they're on the ballot in all 50 states. So that right there really hurts them. Also, most voters support the major parties. And there are a lot of people that may want to vote for a third-party candidate, but ultimately feel that a vote going for a third-party candidate is a wasted vote. And so as a result, they won't vote for the third party candidate, they'll vote for one of the major two parties. That makes it more difficult for those third party candidates. They have to, fight against that perception that the third party candidates can't win. And it's also difficult for them in terms of raising campaign funds. Once again, for largely the same reasons. They're not seen as electable. Major campaign contributors are not likely to donate a lot of money to a campaign that they think isn't or doesn't have a chance, and especially in terms of having influence. A lot of corporations and labor unions may dump a lot of money into campaigns trying to influence an election, and they want to elect candidates that are going to be sympathetic to their views, but it doesn't do them any good to put money behind a candidate that doesn't get elected because they're not in a position to do anything for the contributor. So these are major obstacles that the third parties face. Section 2, Party Organization. Membership and organization. Both Republicans and Democrats are organized into 50 state parties and thousands of local parties as well as a national party. Voters may become members of a party when they register to vote, usually joining the party whose ideas and candidates, in general, they support. So, ultimately, when you register to vote, you pick your political party. You may choose to register Republican, you may choose to register Democrat, you may choose one of the third parties, but ultimately, that's when people join a political party. And like I said, typically people join the party whose views they feel they most align with, or at least if there are some candidates that they particularly like, they may choose that candidate's party, at least early on. Party membership involves no duties or obligations beyond voting. And the truth is, really, you don't even have to vote. Once you register with a political party, you are a member of that party, but you really don't have any duties or responsibilities to the party. You can vote, you have that right, and you can become involved, you can contribute money to the party, you can do volunteer work for the party, but all of those things are optional. So belonging to a political party doesn't obligate you to anything other than just having your party registration with that party until such time that you decide to change your registration, if you should choose to do so. The basic local unit of a party's organization is the precinct or voting district, and wards are made up of several adjoining precincts. The county level is the one in which the party is the most united, and the county chairperson usually exercises a good deal of political power in the county. Yet, counties are the weakest link of the party's organizational chain because they are largely run by volunteers. Now, what this means is, if you look at, for example, here in Stanislaus County, there's a Republican Party of Stanislaus County, there's a Democratic Party of Stanislaus County. Both of those parties, both of those county parties, are members of the respective state parties. So the Republican Party of Stanislaus County is part of the California Republican Party. The Democratic Party of Stanislaus County is part of the Democratic, or the California Democratic Party. And the state parties are part of the national party. So it's all tied into, one party. And of course, the third party candidates, or third parties, a lot of them work the same way. The State Central Committee is composed of members from the party's county organizations, and it is the most important part of the party in each state. Its main function is to help elect the party's candidates for state office. The National Convention and the National Committee are the two main parts of the party's national organization. The National Party chairperson, elected by the National Committee, manages the daily operations of the National Party. And both parties have independent campaign committees for Congress. Political party functions. Excuse me. The political parties recruit candidates to run for office, and both parties are candidate-oriented rather than issue-oriented. But political parties bring important issues to the attention of the public. They publish the party's position on these issues, and they maintain websites and help form public opinion. Personal attacks against the other party's candidates sometimes obscures issues. So in other words, sometimes the focus is taken away from the actual issues and tends to focus on a particular candidate on their personal lives, and sometimes there's grounds for that. For example, there was in New York, there was a congressman who happened to be a Democrat named Anthony Weiner, and he had ultimately tweeted some inappropriate pictures of himself. And then after the story broke and he resigned from Congress, he apparently did it again, and then ultimately decided to run for mayor of New York City, and didn't do very well in that race, particularly because the information came out that he had been, once again, tweeting inappropriate pictures of himself. But, that case attracted national attention. And for him, probably the number one obstacle that he was facing were his personal issues. The issue of these inappropriate pictures. It's why he resigned from Congress, and it was probably the thing that kept him from getting elected in New York. I mean, he may have had a shot at getting elected, but where he stood on the issues kind of became a non-issue because his personal behavior really became the issue. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. I think there's something to be said for having people in political office that behave in an appropriate fashion. But, we also have to realize that, sometimes a personal attack can be a way of diverting attention away from the issues and putting the focus of an election on something else. And since many Americans, to kind of continue that paragraph there, since many Americans are not well informed on issues, parties simplify the choices. A lot of Americans don't have a lot of information on different issues. They may have information on some issues, but there may be many issues they're not well informed on. They just don't have time or are too busy to really completely be up to speed. So they tend to, most Americans will tend to adopt the position that their particular party takes on an issue. And that does simplify the choice for them. Congress and state legislatures carry on their work on the basis of party affiliation. Political parties also dispense patronage, including jobs, contracts, and appointments to government positions. And the party out of power assumes the role of watchdog over government. Typically, they're looking for anything that they can criticize that the other party does. But oftentimes, in that position, they might catch wrongdoing. And of course, they're going to be quick to blow the whistle when they see wrongdoing. And of course, they're doing so because they're motivated to take down the other party, but it does help keep things in check. Because parties need to draw support from many different and sometimes conflicting groups, parties encourage compromise and adopt moderate positions with mass appeal, at least speaking in pretty general terms. I mean, the two major parties, that's the case. They actually, even though it seems like they're polar opposites, they're really not, they tend to not be very much to the extreme. They tend to take more moderate positions, as where some of the third parties may take the more extreme positions. But to really be electable, they usually have to have mass appeal, appealing to people across party lines to some degree in order to be elected. So taking a real radical stance is going to alienate a lot of people. Section 3, nominating candidates. How candidates are selected. 19 states, party leaders hold caucuses, or I should say in 19 states, party leaders hold caucuses to select candidates for public office. As party caucuses came under attack, the nominating convention to choose candidates became popular. And then frequently we see primaries used. The direct primary is the method that is most used by parties today to nominate candidates. And most states hold closed primaries. And what that means in a closed primary, you can only vote for your party. Whatever party you're registered for, you can only vote for that party's candidates in the primary. Now, the primary just narrows it down to who will be on the ticket for the party in the general election. Open primaries, however, some states have open primaries, and in an open primary, you can vote across party lines. So, you could vote, let's say they're doing a primary election for president. Well, in the presidential primaries, in a state with an open primary, you may be registered, for example, let's say as a Republican, but you could vote for the Democratic candidate, or one of the Democratic candidates, if that happened to be who you liked the most, because you could vote across party lines. But in a state with a closed primary, you would only have the Republican candidates to choose from. So, that's how that ties in. That's the difference between an open and a closed primary. Primary elections run according to state law, and they're held at regular polling places and are used to select party candidates for the House, the Senate, governor, and other state and local offices. A person can file a petition signed by a specified number of voters to be placed on the ballot. However, the caucus or convention candidate of the major parties has an advantage because of party backing and resources. Presidential nominations. Every 4 years, each major party holds a nominating convention to choose candidates for president and vice president in the November general election. And they hold those in the summer, usually late summer, usually maybe late July or in August. Really, September kind of marks the beginning of the campaign season for the November election. But generally, these campaigns that really kind of kick off each side's election, they take place in the summer, usually in August. Before the nominating conventions, congressional caucuses selected presidential candidates. Presidential primary elections operate under a wide variety of state laws and party rules in selecting candidates to run for office. So, the exact conditions vary from one state to the next. Some primaries are much earlier, some are much later. California, we have a later primary. Our primary takes place in June, as where many other states, their primaries have already been conducted. It's not uniform across the United States. Criticisms of the presidential primaries include the process extends over too long of a period. That was especially true in 2012 for the Republicans. The Democrats, it wasn't much of an issue because we knew they were selecting Barack Obama, so he didn't have any challenges from within his own party. But on the Republican end, there were many, many candidates, and the primary process took a very long time, started well before the primaries. The primaries tend to focus on the image of a candidate more than on the issues. That's another criticism. And relatively few people vote in primaries, thus the winner may not be as popular as the victory would indicate. And primaries often result in one-sided conventions that become rubber stamp operations. For example, once again, 2012, we knew before the convention started that Barack Obama would be the Democratic nominee. We knew before the Republican convention started that Mitt Romney would be the Republican nominee. So, the nomination, or the committee, the National Convention, didn't really have any major suspense as far as knowing who would be approved. The National Convention. Each party's national committee chooses the site and the date of the convention and decides how many votes each state will have. Many of the delegates who assemble at the convention are already pledged to a candidate, although some are not. On the evening of the opening day, an important party member gives a keynote address, which is a speech intended to unite the party for the coming campaign. In the next day or two, the delegates listen to committee reports and speeches about them. Each party's rules committee governs the way that the convention is run. Most delegates accept the rules committee's report, but sometimes bitter battles are fought by delegates who oppose decisions made by the rules committee. The credentials committee must approve the delegations from each state, and sometimes lively fights have occurred between rival delegations for a state's seats, such as during the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. There was at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, there was an issue over who would represent the state of Mississippi. There ended up being a compromise on that one, but there was a lively debate. Not everybody accepted the compromise. A committee on permanent organization selects the permanent chairperson and other permanent officials for the convention. The platform committee is assigned to the important task of writing the party's platform, a statement of its principles, beliefs, and positions on vital issues. So this happens, once again, as a part of the National Convention every 4 years, and sometimes they drop things out of the party platform that maybe they no longer feel should be there. One issue, there are many different beliefs, many different principles and positions on different issues that are a part of each party's platform. But one example, if we look at, for example, the issue of abortion. In recent years, the Republicans have had the pro-life position as a part of the party's platform, and the Democrats have had the pro-choice view as a part of the party's platform. So, that's just one example. Now, over the years, a party may change their platform, but really what it comes down to is, kind of what's the overall feeling of the members. Not every Republican, for example, may be pro-life, even though it's part of the party platform. Not every Democrat will be pro-choice, even though it may be part of the party's platform. So, over time, if they feel enough party members maybe have changed their view, there might be a movement to drop something from the party platform that has been a part of the party platform. Or as new issues come up, it may become a part of the party's platform. Or a position. But all of this is done, once again, at the National Convention every 4 years. The highlight of the convention is the selection of the party's candidate for president. And once again, in recent years, the frontrunners have had enough committed delegates that it was known that they would be the party's nominee. And they were selected on the first roll call ballot. Really, like I said, we look back at the 2012 election. There was no doubt. We knew that Mitt Romney would be the Republican nominee, and we knew Barack Obama would be the Democratic nominee. You go back another 4 years, 2008. Same thing. We knew it would be McCain for the Republicans and Obama for the Democrats. So, I really can't think of an election where we didn't know who the presidential candidate would be by the time the convention rolled around. But it doesn't have to be that way. The vice presidential nomination sometimes creates suspense because the presidential candidate's choice, who is always selected by the delegates, is not known in advance. And so, sometimes it is. In the 2012 election, we pretty well knew that Barack Obama was going to stick with his current VP, Joe Biden. And we also knew that that Mitt Romney had chosen Paul Ryan as his VP running mate. And that had already been announced. But sometimes that announcement comes at the convention. And that's why I said where there can be a lot of suspense, because there's a lot of speculation as to who they're going to choose. When McCain chose Sarah Palin back in 2008, Memory serves me correct, it was announced during the convention, and it was a surprise because I don't think most people even knew she was in the running. She was little known at that point in time. There were a lot of other people that I believe that were in the running that people considered to be candidates that all the discussion centered around. And the big surprise was that they picked somebody that most people had never heard of. Now, of course, that's no longer the case. Being the VP nominee kind of made Sarah Palin into a star. The vice presidential nominee is usually is chosen to balance the ticket with a person who has a personal, political, or geographic background that is different from the presidential candidates. For example, if you go all the way back to, this goes back prior to my lifetime, but if you go back to Lincoln's presidency, Lincoln chose, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner, as his running mate, feeling that would help him to win some support by putting a Southerner on the ticket. So, that's one example. Another example, McCain's pick of Sarah Palin. A lot of people believe that she was chosen because she was a woman, and that Barack Obama had just won the Democratic primary by defeating Hillary Clinton. And so there was a lot of speculation, and the exact reason we don't really know, but there was a lot of speculation that the pick of Sarah Palin, a female VP candidate, was designed to hopefully appeal to the female voters that were kind of somewhat offended or put off by the fact that Obama had won the Democratic primary. Whether there's truth to that, I don't know. It's just speculation. But like I said, they normally look for somebody that's going to provide a little bit better balance. They have to be concerned with how the ticket is going to play to the voters. And the reality is that in most elections, what decides who's going to win are usually some select counties. And so they develop a whole campaign strategy around those select counties that may tip the election one way or the other. And as a part of that, like I said, they consider what is the appeal of different potential VP candidates, and may they help pull in voters that the presidential candidate would not pull in. The convention adjourns after the presidential and vice presidential candidates have delivered their acceptance speeches, which are intended to unify the party and to appeal to the national television audience. And also, really, this truly really marks the beginning of their campaign. Whichever party has their convention first, they're going to get probably a nice boost in the polls coming off of their convention until the other party has their convention. But really, it kind of marks the beginning of their campaigning. Once they finish their convention, they're going to hit the road and really start campaigning as a team, both the president and vice presidential nominee. And so their speeches are designed usually to once again rally up support, play well to the television audience, and help really rally the base. Chapter 17, Elections and Voting. Our chapter objectives for Chapter 17. Section 1, Election Campaigns. We will examine the role of campaign financing and political parties play in electing candidates for public office. In Section 2, we look at expanding voting rights. We'll summarize the historical expansion of voting rights. And in Section 3, we'll look at influences on voters. We will evaluate the factors that influence voters and non-voters. Section 1, Election Campaigns. Electing the President. Serious candidates for president begin organizing over a year before the election to compete in the spring primaries. After the nominating convention, the candidate runs an intensive campaign from early September until the November election. To win a presidential election, a candidate must receive a majority of the electoral votes. So that's a key, and campaign strategies are designed specifically around that goal, winning a majority of the electoral votes. It's not winning the popular vote in the nation. Now, oftentimes, the candidate that wins the Electoral College also wins the popular vote. But more specifically, the focus is on what they call swing states, states that could go either way. Usually going into election, they have a pretty good idea of what direction certain states, some states are going to go. Some states are pretty much solid one way or the other. For example, most of the southern United States are now what we would call red states. We know that they're going to go to the Republican candidate, almost without question. And that's with most of the southern states. Now, there was a point in time where those states used to be solid blue, but that changed. California has, in recent years, been a blue state. And as a result, the candidates really don't spend very much time campaigning in California. It's seen as being a lost cause, or a waste of time. If you're a Republican and you're running for president, and you know that California, even though it has 55 electoral votes, the most of any state in the nation, if you know that you're not going to win California's electoral votes, coming out and campaigning out here doesn't make a lot of sense. It's kind of a waste of effort, because you're going to lose the state anyway. And if you're a Democrat and you know that you're going to win the state's 55 electoral votes, you don't really need to come and campaign out here either, because you're pretty much guaranteed to get those electoral votes anyway. So the candidates tend to focus on specific states, and not even just specific states, but specific counties in those states that they know can swing the election. There are some counties, and they can break it down that far to know that certain counties are very likely to go one way or the other. But there are counties that are swing counties that they really can't count on. Or there are counties that they simply know if they can rally their party base in that county and get those people out to vote, they have a greater shot at winning that state's electoral votes. So that's really where the election focuses on, and the candidates focus on those key states that they know are going to tip the election, and that's where their effort is concentrated on. States like California, that are pretty much considered to be not in play, don't really get a lot of the focus. Now, they'll come out here when they're fundraising because they can generate a lot of money, a lot of donors here in California, but they don't spend a lot of time in the general election campaign out here in California. The candidate must decide on the kind of strategy that is most likely to achieve victory. And once again, that goes back to why they don't tend to come out here to California in recent times. If California was kind of seen as a state that could go either way, they would definitely campaign here because it would be a very important state to win. But being that California really hasn't been in play, per se, that it's been solidly going to the Democrats in recent years, neither the Republican or the Democrat waste time campaigning here because that strategy isn't likely to help them win the electoral vote. They may win more popular votes in California, but if they're still going to lose the electoral votes, it doesn't help them with the end goal. A strong organization headed by an experienced campaign manager is essential to a campaign. Television and the internet are important tools for presidential candidates. Television conveys the candidate's image, while websites can be used to raise money and to inform the public about the candidate. And not to mention that, this PowerPoint's a little outdated already.
Just within really the last 5 or 6 years, we've really seen the growth of social media. And first it was MySpace, and then Facebook really became the rage, and Twitter has become a big deal. Many candidates for president, as well as congressional candidates, have Twitter accounts. Now, of course, they're limited to snippets. They've only got 140 characters to get their message across, but it provides them an opportunity to help connect with voters through that medium. Many of them do have Facebook pages. Many of them will run Facebook ads as well, because you can buy ads on Facebook. And many of them will do that. They'll use Facebook as a means to get ads out to the people. And many of them also now even have Google Plus accounts as another way to use social media. Running for office is very expensive. For example, presidential and congressional candidates spent a total of $3 billion in the 2002 elections. And keep in mind, that was 11 years ago. If you adjust for inflation, that's a lot more. And plus, actually, campaign spending has continued to increase in recent years and has really gone through the roof. So it's more important now, more than ever, to be able to raise extremely large amounts of money to run for political office, especially if you're trying to win the White House. In the 1970s, a new campaign financing system was set up based on public disclosure of spending, public funding of presidential elections, and limiting or prohibiting the contributions of certain groups. Excuse me. Created in 1974, the Federal Elections Commission, or FEC, is an independent agency that administers federal election laws and keeps records of campaign contributions. And of course, the FEC is still around today, still very active today. The majority of campaign funding comes from private sources, including individual citizens, party organizations, corporations, and special interest groups. Political Action Committees, or PACs or PACs, are established by interest groups to support candidates, but they are limited in the donations that they can make. Connected PACs. Most of the 4,600 active registered PACs are connected PACs established by businesses, labor unions, trade groups, or health organizations. These PACs receive and raise money from a restricted class, generally consisting of managers and shareholders in the case of a corporation, and members in the case of a union or other interest group. As of January 2009, there were 1,598 registered corporate PACs and 272 related to labor unions and 995 to trade organizations. Non-connected PACs. Groups with an ideological mission, single-issue groups, and members of Congress and other political leaders may form non-connected PACs. These organizations may accept funds from any individual, business PAC, or organization. As of January 2009, there were 1,594 non-connected PACs, the fastest growing category. Super PACs. Starting with the 2010 elections, we saw the rise of super PACs, which can raise unlimited sums from corporations, unions, and other groups, as well as individuals. The super PACs were made possible by the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission decision by the Supreme Court, oftentimes simply referred to as the Citizens United decision. The groups can also mount the kind of direct attacks on candidates that were not allowed in the past. And these have become fairly controversial. Once again, the Citizens United, a Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court in effect said money is speech and that corporations are people, and therefore corporations, as well as people, can give unlimited amounts of money or unlimited speech in that regard, since we have free speech, towards campaigns. However, the super PACs are not allowed to coordinate directly with candidates or political parties, and they are required to disclose their donors. But there's a loophole. While the super PACs are required to disclose their donors, in some cases their donors may receive money from other donors that doesn't have to be disclosed. This brings us to the 501c4 organizations. And 501c organizations are basically nonprofit groups, but the C4 organizations are really designed primarily for political purposes. And these organizations are not required to disclose their donors publicly. This aspect of the law has led to the extensive use of the 501c4 provisions for organizations that are actively involved in lobbying and has become controversial. See, let's say a company had a super PAC. Well, the super PAC may have to disclose their donors, and their donor may be their own 501c4 organization. But the 501c4 doesn't have to disclose its donors. Therefore, it allows them to circumnavigate the law. They can work their way around the law and bypass it by having their contributors give their money to the 501c4. The 501c4 doesn't have to disclose where it got its money, and it can turn around and give that money to the super PAC. The super PAC discloses that it came from the 501c4, but you don't know where the 501c4 got its money because it didn't have to disclose. It's a way around the intended purpose of the law. In 2010, a bill called the Disclose Act was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives that addressed the identification of donors to organizations involved in political advocacy, but the bill failed to pass in the Senate. In the summer of 2011, comedian Stephen Colbert brought attention to the issue of super PACs by forming his own and a 501c4. As of August 2011, 165,000 of his viewers had joined it. Financing campaigns. Two methods are used to get around campaign spending limits. Soft money donations, which are contributions given directly to a political party for general purposes such as voter registration drives, and issue advocacy advertisements, which support an issue rather than a particular candidate. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, passed in 2002, bans soft money donations to national political parties, but its constitutionality remains in question. The FEC regulates campaigns online. For example, all campaign websites that cost $250 or more must be registered with the FEC. Section 2, expanding voting rights. Early limitations on voting. Before the American Revolution, women and African Americans, white males who did not own property, and persons who were not members of dominant religious groups were excluded from voting. During the early 1800s, states gradually abolished property and religious requirements for voting, and by the mid-1800s, the nation had achieved universal white male suffrage, meaning that all white men could vote. Woman suffrage. By 1914, women had won the right to vote in 11 states. The 19th Amendment, ratified after World War I, granted women in all states the right to vote. And 1920 was the first major election that women across the nation could vote in. African American suffrage. Enslaved African Americans were not allowed to vote, and free African Americans could vote only in a few states until 1870. The 15th Amendment, passed after the Civil War, granted the vote to African Americans in both state and national elections, but it did not result in full voting rights for African Americans. Southern states set up restrictive voting qualifications. Some southern states used literacy tests to disqualify African Americans from voting, and poll taxes, or money payments required before voting, and grandfather clauses excusing white voters from paying the tax were devices used to discourage the African Americans from voting. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and later voting rights laws brought the federal government directly into the electoral process in the states, ending official discrimination against African Americans and increasing their political strength and participation in government. Now, a little side note. This last summer, the Supreme Court rendered a decision overturning parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And now, as a result, the federal government has a little less oversight into state-run elections. Some states, former southern states that had a history of discrimination, had to get any changes that they made to their voting procedures approved by the federal government before they can make changes. That requirement has gone away. The Supreme Court's stating that times have changed. It's no longer necessary. But as they've said that, some states have already made moves to push for voter ID laws, which would disproportionately disenfranchise African American voters. So the issue is still a hot button issue. So here we go. In 2013, the Supreme Court overturned part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, saying that times have changed. Many question whether or not this decision will lead to the disenfranchisement of minority voters. The 26th Amendment. This amendment lowered the voting age to 18 throughout the nation. The amendment helped to satisfy those young people who could not be drafted, or rather, who could be drafted into the military but could not vote. Now, of course, this happened amidst the backdrop of the very controversial Vietnam War. This amendment was pushed through because we were drafting young men as young as 18 or 19 into the military, and yet they weren't allowed to vote until they were 21. And there is something very fundamentally wrong with not allowing people to vote and then forcing them to serve their country in a situation that could get them killed. They could have simply raised the draft age to 21, but largely for strategic military purposes, they felt it was better to lower the voting age. So that's why that was done. Section 3, influences on voters. Okay, looking at the personal background of voters. Voters' ages may affect their views and determine their voting decisions. Education, religion, and racial or ethnic background affect voters' attitudes. But voters do not always vote in keeping with their backgrounds. Cross-pressured voters. Those caught between conflicting elements in their lives may vote based on the issues and candidates. Cross-pressured voters is something that can occur. For example, you may have people that maybe they were raised in a conservative family with conservative values, but maybe they're union members. That could create cross pressures. Their family background may make them want to vote Republican, for example, where their job makes them more likely to vote Democrat. Loyalty to political parties. Because the majority of American voters consider themselves either Republicans or Democrats, most vote for their party's candidates. Not all party members vote for their party's candidates, though. Some are strong party voters, which means they generally always stick with their party, and others are weak party voters. Independent voters, who have increased in numbers, do not belong to either major party, but are an important element in presidential elections. Issues in election campaigns. Many current voters are better informed than past voters because they are better educated. Current issues have a greater impact on their personal lives, and television imparts information on issues. Still, most voters are not fully informed on campaign issues. The 1980 presidential election demonstrated the importance of issues. The high rate of inflation, the cost of living, and the high rate of unemployment were issues debated by the candidates that clearly helped Reagan win the election. The candidate's image. Americans want someone they can trust as a national leader. Voters often select candidates for the image that they project. Propaganda. Political parties and candidates use ideas, information, and rumors to influence voters with propaganda techniques. Name-calling, testimonials, bandwagon, transfer, plain folks, and card stacking help to win votes. Name-calling is simply, kind of the tactic of using names or labels. It's not so much names like sitting there in a childish fashion name-calling, but they use labels. Like radical or liberal or extremist. Those are types of terms or labels that they put on people in name calling. Testimonials. They may have people give a testimony that backs a candidate or how a candidate's impacted them. Bandwagon. That's the idea where you look for people to jump on the bandwagon. People kind of go with the flow of things. Transfer is where people may transfer feelings they have, positive feelings or negative feelings, from something to a candidate. The candidates will oftentimes try to be involved with positive things that will create a positive transfer of feelings. And plain folks, that's kind of the idea of just kind of trying to relate to people on a personal level as being just an average Joe. And that's something else they will try to do. For example, Sarah Palin oftentimes is criticized for her, trying to be folksy or relate to people on that level. And card stacking, that's another strategy to help win votes, where they try to stack all the cards in their favor. The profile of regular voters. Regular voters have positive attitudes towards government and citizenship. Generally, regular voters have more education and a higher than average income. Middle-aged citizens have the highest voter turnout. The profile of non-voters. They may not meet citizenship, residency, and registration requirements. The percentage of voters among those who are eligible has declined. Chapter 18, Interest Groups and Public Opinion. Our chapter objectives for Section 1, we look at interest group organization. We'll define the types of interest groups in the United States. Section 2, affecting public policy. Explain how lobbyists affect public policy. Section 3, Shaping Public Opinion. We'll investigate how public opinion is formed in the United States. Measuring public opinion. Section 4, we'll evaluate the methods used to measure public opinion. Section 1, Interest Group Organization. The power of interest groups. Members of interest groups share common goals and organize to influence government. Interest groups are concerned only with a few issues or problems. They unite people with common values or attitudes from various regions. Interest groups help to bridge the gap between citizens and the government. Interest groups draw their strength from the financial resources, numbers, and expertise of their members. Leadership and members. Interest groups help promote their members' economic self-interest, beliefs, values, or attitudes to help create group unity. Although membership in interest groups is a right of all, many people do not belong to such groups, even the people who might benefit the most. Business and labor groups. Business groups, such as the National Association of Manufacturers, are among the oldest and largest interest groups. The AFL-CIO and other large unions are important interest groups that play a major role in national politics. Agricultural groups. 3 major interest groups represent almost 6 million farmers. Agricultural interest groups include the American Farm Bureau Federation, the National Farmers Union, and the Grange. Other interest groups. The American Bar Association and the American Medical Association are interest groups that include members of specific professions. Hundreds of environmental groups are concerned about the environment and the impact of environmental regulation on private property. Groups concerned about the public interest, such as Public Citizens Incorporated and Common Cause, seek policy goals that they believe will benefit all citizens. Officials of state and local governments also form organizations to seek to influence the President and Congress. Many other interest groups promote a particular cause, support the aims of large segments of the population, or support civil rights. Foreign governments and private interest of foreign nations may also seek to influence the government of the United States. Section 2, Affecting Public Policy. The work of lobbyists. Most interest groups use lobbying or making direct contact with lawmakers or other government leaders to influence government policy. Now, the term lobbying, it is believed that originally Congress members gathered kind of in the lobby, and that's where people that wanted to influence the congressman would come and try to meet with them in the lobby and influence them, and that's how the term lobbying originated. But that's what they mean. When they say lobbying, it's really they're trying to influence our political leaders. Since 1995, lobbyists must register, report their activities, and disclose the amount of money spent to influence lawmakers. Many lobbyists formerly worked for government and know its politics and people. Other lobbyists are lawyers or public relations experts. For example, it's not uncommon for members of Congress to leave Congress and then go to work for a private organization as lobbyists themselves, where they already kind of have an in, knowing the inner workings of Congress and having connections in Congress. Lobbyists can provide lawmakers with useful information supporting an interest group's position. They can give testimony before congressional committees, and they can even help draft bills. Interest groups seek support Interest or pressure groups use the mass media to inform the public and to create support for their views. Interest groups encourage their members to write letters to the government officials to demonstrate broad support for or against public policy. While interest groups have influence, their effectiveness is limited because many different groups compete, and thus no single group can control lawmakers or other public officials. The larger the interest group, the more diverse are the interests of its members, making it difficult for the group to adopt broad policy goals. Most interest groups do not have a large financial base and must struggle just to pay their staffs. The rise of political action committees. Interest groups provide a large percentage of the funds used in candidates' election campaigns, collecting these funds mostly through political action committees or PACs. When campaign laws were reformed in 1974, new laws limited the amounts that individuals could contribute to federal candidates, but permitted the PACs of labor unions and corporations to make direct contributions. PACs grew to more than 4,000 in the 1990s, although during the 1970s, the new laws regulated and limited the funds that they raised. PACs can give only $5,000 directly to each candidate per election, but PACs' spending is not limited as long as they do not work directly with the candidates. In 1976, the Supreme Court ruled any independent group could give money to a political candidate as long as it did not have legal ties to that candidate, resulting in a great increase in PAC spending. The Federal Election Commission ruled in 1975 that corporations could administer their own PACs and use payroll deductions to raise money from employees, resulting in a far larger increase in corporate PAC spending than in labor PAC spending. Several decisions by the Supreme Court, such as Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, promoted the growth of PACs, and in 1996, the court held that spending in support of federal candidates was a form of free speech, and thus such spending could not be limited, kind of partially the basis for the previously mentioned Citizens United decision. PACs and the groups that they serve. Affiliated PACs, or PACs tied to corporations, labor unions, trade groups, or health organizations make up about 70% of all PACs, and they raise money from voluntary contributions. Independent PACs, or PACs interested in particular causes such as abortion, farm subsidies, or the environment, are not connected to any existing business or organization, and they raise money largely through direct mail appeals. Strategies for influence. Interest groups may promise to provide campaign support or to withhold such support in order to influence lawmakers to favor their policies. Interest groups, especially PACs, raise much of the money spent in political campaigns, usually supporting incumbents. With interest group support, incumbents generally have a good chance of re-election. It's probably good that I clarify what an incumbent is. An incumbent is somebody who's already in office running for re-election. Some members of Congress acknowledge the power of PACs, but claim that PACs' influence does not determine their votes. Interest groups, too, sometimes question the value of lobbying and funding candidates. It is difficult to determine whether special interest lobbies have an overall positive or negative effect on government. Shaping public policy. The nature of public opinion. Public opinion includes the ideas and attitudes of diverse citizens. Many different groups hold different opinions on almost every issue. Interest groups and polls help inform government officials of public opinion. Significant numbers must hold an opinion to influence public officials. Political socialization. Political socialization involves learned political beliefs and attitudes. The parent's political party often becomes the party of their children. Schools also play an important part in political socialization, not just from the fact that the school itself, the teachers may inadvertently share their political leanings or have influence on the students and influence students' opinions, but peers as well. Peer influence can definitely have an impact as well. Close friends, religious groups, clubs, work groups, and economic and social status influence political socialization as well. The mass media, especially television, can directly affect political attitudes. The president, members of Congress, and interest groups try to influence opinions. Political culture. A political culture is a set of shared values and beliefs about a nation. Belief in and support for liberty and freedom, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, political equality, private property rights, and individual achievement are part of the United States political culture. Ideology and public policy. Ideology is a set of beliefs about life, culture, government, and society. Most Americans determine their positions on an issue by issue basis rather than by an ideology. In other words, most Americans look at a specific issue in isolation. They don't base it solely upon an ideological viewpoint that tends to shape how they look at opinions. A liberal believes the national government should be very active in helping individuals and communities promote health, justice, and equal opportunity. A conservative believes that the role of government in society should be very limited and that individuals should be responsible for their own well-being. Since the 1970s, most Americans consider themselves to be political moderates, which means they're probably somewhere in the middle or close to the middle between these two extremes. They're not entirely liberal or liberal on all issues, and they're not entirely conservative or conservative on all issues. They believe that there's kind of a happy medium. Section 4, measuring public opinion. The traditional methods. Political parties inform party leaders about voters' attitudes. Members of interest groups contact public officials about specific issues such as gun control, health care, auto safety, and so forth. The mass media measure program ratings to gauge public interest. Politicians use newspapers, magazine cover stories, editorials, letters to the editor, talk shows, and television newscasts to keep track of public interest. And now I'd probably argue they probably also somewhat monitor Facebook accounts. They somewhat monitor Twitter postings, especially the hashtags, to kind of keep track of political opinions. Letter writing campaigns to public officials by mail, fax, and email indicate levels of support and opposition for specific issues. So, when people take the time to write their congressman about an issue, and many interest groups will address certain issues, certain legislation that they take a position on, and they will encourage members to write their congressman to either show support for a particular bill or to object to a particular bill. Straw polls, organized by media, provide responses to specific questions. Scientific polling. In a scientific poll, the term universe refers to the group of people that are to be studied, such as all Texans or all women in the United States. A representative sample is a small group of people that is typical of the universe. So once again, if the universe you're studying, for example, is all women in the United States, then your representative sample wouldn't look like an isolated group of women, but it would really have a consistent makeup of all of the women in the United States. You wouldn't, for example, just want to look at, white women only, and not consider minority groups, or you wouldn't want to, because that wouldn't be representative of the universe. You wouldn't want to just look at a certain age group, like only consider old women, elderly, because you would be neglecting all the women that are not elderly. So a representative sample is going to be pretty equally distributed with what the actual population is. So you have to look at the population. Just if your universe is all of the women in the United States, you'd really have to look at the population distribution in terms of minority representation, as well as in terms of age distribution, and make sure your representative sample proportionally was pretty equivalent to the universe in order to truly be representative. Most pollsters use representative samples to measure public opinion. Using a random sample gives everyone in the universe an equal chance of being selected. A sampling error defines how much the results may differ from the sample universe. A cluster sample is a group of people from the same geographical area. Pollsters may weigh the results for race, age, gender, or education. The way a question is phrased can greatly influence people's responses, and sometimes that can be used to manipulate. Sometimes the way you ask a question may reveal how they may not necessarily reveal very accurately how they feel. You can ask it in such a way that you're likely to get a certain response. Polls conducted through telephone interviews and questionnaires sent by mail are cheaper and more convenient than face-to-face interviews. Poll results are only a snapshot of public opinion. Poll results can be influenced by the interviewer's appearance or tone of voice, and the interviewees need to seem knowledgeable or socially acceptable. The framers of the Constitution recognized that large numbers of citizens could not run the day-to-day government. They created a government in which people have an active voice by voting for lawmakers. The resulting government is responsive to the people, but it is not subject to the shifting whims of public opinion. Chapter 19, the mass media. Our chapter objectives, Section 1, how media impact government. We will discuss the role of mass media in United States politics. Section 2, regulating print and broadcast media. We'll evaluate the role the government plays in regulating the mass media. Section 3, the Internet and democracy. We'll analyze the impact of the Internet on the government in the United States. Section 1, how media impact government. The President and the media. The President is an important source of news. 80% of all media coverage of the national government focuses on the president. Modern presidents and their staffs try to manage relations with the mass media in various ways in order to sell their policies and programs to the public. The White House uses news releases and briefings, as well as press conferences, to make announcements and to explain policies, decisions, or actions. The president or another top official sometimes gives reporters important pieces of information in a backgrounder, which the media report without naming the source of the information. Top government officials also provide the media with information off the record and through news leaks. Modern presidents stage news events to reinforce their positions on issues. Media and presidential campaigns. Television greatly impacts presidential campaigns by, 1, requiring that candidates be telegenic, meaning they have to come off well on television. It's not just a matter of being, well spoken. They need to sound well. They need to look good and come across well with people. Little things like their nonverbal communication become crucial. 2, making it possible for unknowns to quickly become serious candidates. For example, Sarah Palin, virtual unknown as the Alaska governor, hadn't really even been in office that long when she was selected to be John McCain's running mate. Television helped to make her overnight into a huge name, and now she's pretty much a household name. And that happened very rapidly. In fact, almost immediately by the end of the 2008 election, people were talking about her for a potential 2012 election campaign, or the possibility of her running herself. And 3, encouraging celebrities from other fields to enter politics. And that oftentimes happens. It makes it very easy. We've seen it time and time again. Ronald Reagan was a well-known movie actor before he decided to go into politics. He would go on to become governor of California and, of course, a two-term president of the United States. Arnold Schwarzenegger entered politics. He became a governor of California for 2 terms. And there are many sports figures that may transition. Jesse Ventura, a former professional wrestler turned governor, entered politics largely because he had a name already recognized from his days as a so-called pro wrestler. So there are a lot of people that may build a name for themselves in some other fashion and then go into politics and then build a political career from there. The mass media coverage of nominations, especially primaries presented in horse race terms, has fundamentally changed the presidential nominating process. Early primaries are covered intensely by the media and so become critically important, establishing the frontrunners, even though the states involved represent only a small fraction of the national electorate. And in fact, quite literally, what happens is that when they start these primaries, candidates who don't do well in the early primaries find it harder to raise money and to keep their campaign going. And so, even though it's a relatively small number or small portion of the electorate that's represented by these first few states, it plays a key role in determining what happens from that point on, largely because of the media coverage. Television has also affected how candidates communicate with the voters, relying largely on spot advertising, which is the technique used to sell most products on television. That's relying upon basically campaign commercials. Television advertising campaigns cost candidates huge sums of money. And in fact, most of these campaigns that we see oftentimes are not specifically for the candidate, but oftentimes they run attack ads against the other candidate. Negative campaign ads have proven very effective. But once again, there's a huge expense in purchasing television ads. Television has weakened the role of political parties as the key link between politicians and the voters in the national politics, and has made candidates less dependent on their political party organization, especially once they've kind of got a name. The front-running candidates are the only ones able to attract the needed funds to succeed in the long nominating process, and the candidates for each party are clearly identified months before the nominating conventions. Congress and the media. Congressional coverage in the news media focuses on individual members and tends to report on the most controversial aspects of Congress, such as confirmation hearings, oversight activities, and the personal business of members. Senate confirmation hearings attract wide media coverage, and the media often conduct their own investigations of those nominated for office. Media coverage of certain congressional investigations, such as Watergate, has created some of the biggest stories in American politics. The news media try to create big stories by looking for scandal in the personal activities of members of Congress. Both the House and Senate allow television coverage of floor proceedings, and both have recording studios where lawmakers prepare radio and television messages for the voters back home. The court and the media. The Supreme Court and the lower federal courts receive much less media coverage than the executive and legislative branches because of the remoteness of judges and the technical nature of the issues with which the courts deal. The Supreme Court holds no news conferences and keeps to the tradition that its decisions must speak for themselves. Now, of course, granted, when the Supreme Court announces decisions, such as this summer when there are several decisions that were announced, the media pays attention to those key cases and reports on them. But, once again, you don't hear the justices coming out and making statements. Now, their written opinions are frequently shared by the media, or excerpts, at least, of them. Setting the public agenda. The public agenda is a list of societal problems that both political leaders and citizens agree need governmental attention. The news media play a very important role in setting the public agenda by highlighting some issues and ignoring others. Competition between media networks influences which decisions the media should cover. Networks try to attract a large audience by focusing on stories that will interest the largest number of viewers. The media also have a major impact on public opinion towards government and issues by influencing people's attitudes and values. Section 2, regulating print and broadcast media. Protecting the media. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of the press. The press is free from prior restraint, which basically that means they can't really be censored beforehand. They can't be restricted as what information that they can put out. In other words, they don't have to run their stories by the government to get approval before they can print them. Public officials almost never win libel suits because there is no law against criticizing government officials. The right to gather information. Lower courts have generally have supported the right of the press to have information about government actions and decisions. The media have fought in the courts for shield laws to avoid disclosing sources. No such federal law exists, though more than half the states have them. Regulating broadcast media. The federal government has the power to regulate the broadcast media because airways are a public resource. The Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, regulates interstate and international communications by radio, television, telephone, telegraph, cable, and satellite. The FCC cannot censor broadcast, but it can fine stations that violate rules. Regulate the broadcast media. The extent of FCC content regulation varies in response to changing technology, court rulings, and changes in the political climate. For example, the controversial fairness doctrine, which required broadcasters to guarantee equal airtime to both sides of a controversial issue, was removed during the Reagan administration. Until 1996, the federal government set rules for media ownership to prevent a few owners from gaining control of the news and entertainment in the largest American cities. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 ended or greatly relaxed many of the FEC's limits on media ownership with the goal of increasing competition, and it also tried to control violent and obscene content in the mass media. Media and national security. National security concerns may conflict with citizens' need to know, especially in foreign affairs, where weapons, intelligence information, and military secrets often are involved. Government restriction on media coverage of military actions has varied. Media reporting on the Vietnam War and the secret Pentagon Papers in 1991 caused controversy. Tensions caused government to limit access to the battlefield during the 1991 Persian Gulf War. The Internet and democracy. Key issues of the Internet. The Internet is rapidly developing a widespread audience. The Internet supports interactive communications among many people at once, which allows political activists to quickly mobilize huge numbers of supporters. And of course, this isn't only true here in the United States. We've even seen it, especially through social media. Facebook was widely used as a tool behind the 2011 Egyptian revolution, where the protesters began organizing their protests online. So, social media has frequently been used as a means of communication now on the Internet. Internet organizations and activities are spread around the world, and as a result, it is often not clear which national laws govern Internet activities, which makes it, of course, very difficult to regulate. Gathering information. Thousands of websites devoted to politics and government are sponsored by government agencies, Congress, political parties, universities, and interest groups. Some of these websites may be partisan, meaning that they support only their point of view on issues. Legislation can be tracked online through a government database called COMIS. Electronic mailing lists alert subscribers to current information on an issue, and local, state, and federal government websites local, state, and federal government websites provide information and services, such as absentee ballot and license applications. Now, also, probably I should mention under gathering information, we've recently learned that the NSA has collected information not only on our phone calls, keeping track of what numbers have called what numbers and how frequently, but they've also have somewhat had access, at least to some of our online access, keeping track of people as well, which has been a growing concern in terms of invasion of privacy issues and how much power should be given to the government. The impact on citizen participation. Citizens can use email to communicate with government officials. Political organizers use online action alerts and electronic petitions to spread information quickly to gain support for an issue. And once again, keep in mind, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Google+, MySpace, any of these are places that people could post action alerts. They could post it on their website, share a link to it on Facebook, for example, or on Twitter to drive people to the site to take action. Grassroots websites are set up by individual citizens supporting their favorite candidate or issue and provide a way for citizens to become active in election politics at any level of government. And once again, that also applies to social media. Election candidate websites supply information on how to volunteer for an election campaign or political cause. Cyber volunteering is a class of volunteer activities that can only be done on the internet. Many states are currently conducting studies or tests on how to conduct online electronic voting in primary and general elections. And once again, social media. Increasingly, social media sites such as YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are being used by politicians and special interest groups to communicate, share ideas, organize, and to spread propaganda. And what you see down here below is really a number of things of propaganda that have been pulled off the internet. So here's a political cartoon that I found shared on social media. That this depicts with past presidents the highest income tax rate, and then the income tax rate that Obama was trying to push things up to, and and the reaction of people calling it socialism. Another one here says, I don't think the common person is getting it. I just think if you're lower income, 1, you're not as educated, 2, you don't understand how it works. That was a Romney donor on her way to a $75,000 per couple Hamptons fundraiser in July of 2012, as quoted by the LA Times. And this was posted on Facebook. Here's another one. So these ones here are probably more, I guess you'd say, probably come from a liberal perspective, and these come from more of a conservative perspective. Obama had once, made the statement referring to small business owners that, you didn't build that, talking specifically really about the public roads and infrastructure that they use. But, here they take a picture of Obama with a little kid and, with the saying, you didn't build that. And another one here, another piece of propaganda. The government did help kind of bail out General Motors by actually taking part ownership. So here it now changes GM from General Motors to Government Motors with Obama's picture. And of course, Obama's campaign slogan is a part of the GM logo. So that's another way propaganda is spread. And even misinformation can easily be spread through email campaigns and now through social media as well, deliberately sometimes to influence elections. Challenges for public policy. In Reno versus the American Civil Liberties Union, 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment guarantees the freedom of expression on the internet. Controversy exists between state and local governments and some companies about whether to tax e-commerce or the sale of goods and services online.